welcome. This is our second episode of Consciousness Rising Zimbabwe and Beyond. And it is a YouTube channel, and it's a platform for people to coming from all walks of life to be interviewed and telling us their stories. And it's been hosted by Tanya Norris and myself. And so these people are making a difference in their own communities, and therefore we believe that they're making a difference also to the world we are living in. And so today at Consciousness Rising Zimbabwe and Beyond, we have the pleasure of having as a guest our own Rachel Nyaradzo Adams and of Narachi Leadership. And she's a leadership specialist, a coach, and also speaker. So welcome, Rachel. We are so excited to have you here.
Thank you, Antonella. Thank you for having me.
And also, let me just tell you some of the background of Rachel so that we get, because she's got a very interesting career. So Rachel, she's been coaching and developing high-impact leaders her entire professional career. Rachel works from the conviction that a leader's greatest work is their own self-mastery before they can proceed to lead others and systems. To do so, she creates a safe space for clients to explore both their light and shadow and integrate the two towards authentic power. Rachel trained as an anthropologist and sharpened her skill in leadership development at Alan Grace Orbis Foundation, McKinsey, and Yale University before founding Narachi Leadership. Rachel and I met through a common friend, maybe a year and a half ago. She was supposed to interview me, and then it didn't happen. Life went different direction. Now I'm interviewing you first. So we have an interview. And we have
That's what's important.
So once again, warm welcome to you, Rachel. So let's start with what you describe on your bio on the Narachi Leadership website. At some point you say that you found yourself frustrated by the constant criticism on poor leadership on the African continent. And that actually became your call. So tell us more.
Yeah, so I am of the conviction that our deepest work happens when we pay attention to what gives us the greatest joy or what gives us the greatest frustration. And for me, I was deeply, deeply frustrated by the reputation of leadership on the African continent. Everywhere I went, for example, when I was doing my master's degree in African studies at Oxford, a lot of our interrogations were about, why Africa doesn't work. How can we get it to work? How can we get it off aid? How can we get the elections to be free and fair? How can we get the economies to be more diversified and more resilient and robust so that they can actually support the humans inhabiting them? And, how do we get health systems to be better and educational systems to be better? And it was so frustrating. It was doing my head in that this is the only conversation we were having. I mean, of course, there were nuances of countries that have done well or have promise or potential, but it just always felt to me that the continent was not self-actualizing. It wasn't coming into the fullness of its power. And so because I was always interested in people, I studied anthropology, but I really have been studying people since I was this high. I started to ask myself, what causes that? What gets us into a space where we have this thing called poor leadership? And of course, leadership is about people, and people are individuals who come together to create a collective, and that collective may or may not work. So I started to say, okay, so it's people then we must work with people to make them better so that they can make better formations that work. And that's how, for me, the leadership development became my calling, became a thing. But I believe it was my calling even before I came to this earth. But, you know, it came alive to me with those kinds of interrogations and explorations.
Yeah. And so now that you've been, have you been working only on the African continent or also beyond African countries?
So when I was at Yale, I was working in the United States. I was in New Haven, Connecticut at Yale University. And then the other time I was out of the country was when I was in the United Kingdom, where initially I was raising money to go to school, and then where also I did my master's degree in African Studies at Oxford. But for the most part, I've been on the African continent. And with Nyarachi leadership, I always say my jealousy is to give all of my energy to African leaders, because that's where I feel my best work will be done.
So what have you really found in the leadership? I mean, what are the strengths and the weaknesses in African leadership? If you were their coach, I mean, what would you drive the change, for change to happen? I mean, how would you drive it?
So maybe let me not frame it as strengths and weaknesses. Let me frame it as what is the best work we can do that then allows us to come into authentic power and therefore authentic leadership. And, you know, I believe that the journey of self-mastery is about coming into relationship with both the light and the shadow of who we are and paying attention to our inner world. If we don't pay attention to the inner world, what we start to project into the outer world is extremely undisciplined, right? It doesn't then serve the purpose of bringing full actualization, both of self, but also of the people we desire to serve as leaders. So for me, the greatest strength of leadership comes from personal mastery as a leader. And what I sometimes observe, not just in Africa, by the way, across the world, is that many leaders struggle to sit with themselves, to get into a relationship that is deep enough with the self to explore and understand where the strengths and where the weaknesses are, and to be able to name them. You know, so one of the weaknesses I come across, for example, is this inability to name weaknesses and to name shadows. Because only when we can do that can we get the support that we need in order to experience the wholeness of teams. But if you as a leader are continually masking and not showing your full self, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, it doesn't bode well to create trust, to create commitment, to create accountability, you know, to create a commitment to results. And aren't these all of the struggles that we have on the continent, right? Is how do we create robust enough collective action that is steeped in trust and accountability and commitment, and that actually yields the kinds of results that we desire, you know? And so for me, the work is to show leaders that it is safe to be able to walk this journey with yourself. And when you've done so, to then be able to emerge in the full power of your leadership.
Yeah, I personally strongly believe in the power of vulnerability, in the sense that, of course, you don't have to be vulnerable in front of everybody, but if you can't have access to your own to be vulnerable to yourself first, change can't happen, because we can't see we can't admit that all of us have patterns that we want to change. I mean, that's a fact. Yeah. So thank you for that. So I always believe that we have two bio, one for the public and one one that can touch people's heart. So the one that can inspire really people. So tell your story a bit more in depth. What brought you to where you are now?
Yeah. So I was born in Gweru. I'm from Zimbabwe, as you said, born I was actually, that's not true. I was born in Kadoma, grew up in Gweru. So I moved to Gweru when I was 4 years old. I grew up in quite a big family. I've got 12 siblings in total. So you can imagine that my skills in people had been honed from a very, very young age. I went to school in Gweru, both my primary school and high school, where, a lot of the formations and the passions of what I do today started to take shape, so I always enjoyed, while I was quite shy personally, I enjoyed the stage. I enjoyed acting and dramatic performance. And when I reflect on it, I think a lot of that is because I enjoyed the possibility of creating persona and creating character. And the stage allowed you to do that. And I think it was my first introduction to this idea that you can continue to create yourself. You can continue to work on your persona and the fullness of who you are, so that it can manifest in the ways in which you desire. So that for me was the beginning of it. And then when I finished high school, I hit one of my most darkest tunnels, which was that I was confronted with the fact that, there was no money to continue education. And, as you know, in Zimbabwe, education is so pivotal to who we are. And so after university, the natural idea is that after high school, the natural idea is you go to university. And there I was confronted with the fact that there was no money for university. So I moved to the United Kingdom and to live with my brother, where I started to work to raise money for university. And, I was working jobs I was sweeping floors in a bakery. I was making sandwiches. I was working in a department store, spritzing perfume and working at the counters. And it was a time in my life that really started to cultivate in me courage. I have a very personal relationship with courage, especially courage as an inner journey that you walk. I always say courage is first an inner and quiet journey before it becomes sort of a loud, heroic thing. And the courage, the introduction to courage for me was holding on to my dreams and holding on despite external evidence to the idea that I yearned for something and I wanted to create it and I was going to hold on. So I worked and people said to me, forget about it, you'll never make it to university. And I said, I will. And finally, after 3 years, I'd raised enough money to start university, and the rest is history. But another interesting thing that was happening at that time is I was starting to have conflict internally about religion. I was raised in a Christian home, initially Catholic and then Anglican, and then I became Pentecostal. I actually went to Bible college while I was in the United Kingdom, went and studied to be a preacher. And ironically, as soon as I had finished studying to be a preacher, all of a sudden I had all this conflict inside of me about the meaning of religion. I've often said it's because, when you live in Zimbabwe, it's quite easy to believe that everybody is Christian, because most of the country is Christian. You have other denominations and beliefs, of course, but most of the country is Christian. And so, for example, the idea that if you do not convert to Christ, that you would be punished in the afterlife was kind of, you could stomach it because there were only a few people you had to pray for conversion. But when I found myself in the United Kingdom, where the larger population actually is a-religious or has a different religion, so I was meeting people who were Sikhs and people who were Taoists, Baha'is. I had never heard these words before. I was like, what are these religions? And all of a sudden, I started to question what it means to be confined to one belief system when there's so many of them in the world, and what it means to say that one group has a better understanding of who God is than another. And so that was my conversion from religion to spirituality. I actually left the Christian church in 2003 and started to find myself in a more profound relationship with God, with what created, with source. And I found at that point no desire to name who God is. I found myself wanting to only have an experience of God and not a name. And so for me, that was one of the most powerful conversions that happened to me at that time, was finding this journey of courage, but also at the same time finding this much deeper relationship with source. And that for me was a powerful transformation. I hope that summates a little bit of the more personal journey.
Well, it does, because I mean, this passage that you say from religion to spirituality, sometimes if we are lucky, the two combines, but many times they don't. And that doesn't mean that not having a so-called religion, which is a set of rules and practices and lots of other things, doesn't mean that we are not spiritual or there is not this connection. Because in the end, it's whatever is life affirming is what I consider that is what it works. And for sure,
Absolutely.
it is life affirming. I personally
absolutely. I mean, in fact,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
I was
sorry.
going to say that
Yeah.
You talked about the beliefs, the practices, the rules. And, I was just adding to that rituals, because one of the things that people say to me now is, so if you don't have a religion, do you pray? How do you pray? And I said, one of the biggest epiphanies I had in 2003 when I left the church, and I remember this was at the last point at which I knelt to pray to God in the way that I've been trained in the Christian tradition, was I had the epiphany that every breath that I take is a prayer. Every exhale and inhalation is a prayer and a connection to source and to God. And so for me, I didn't need the ritual anymore. So when people say to me, do you get down on your knees and pray? No, I don't, because I believe that my entire life is a prayer. My work is a prayer, right? It's an offering to the highest part of who we are and the source that created us. So that for me has been a big transformation.
And a friend of mine who has been one of my guides is always saying, Antonella, you become the prayer. You are the prayer. You don't need anything. You become the prayer.
Yes.
So, and that also for myself made such a big shift. Such a big shift. Yeah. So, whoa, that's quite, but I love, because in the end, it's all about people. In the end, is helping people to change their own life. Or being a preacher, you're a different type of preacher at the moment.
Absolutely, I think I am still preaching, right?
Oh yeah,
it's a different kind of preaching.
Yeah, you shepherd them in a different direction. Yes,
I love that. Yeah.
So, we've spoken about self-mastery, we've spoken about courage, which is a word that you really, I've heard you using many times. So it's something that is probably one of your core values, I would say, just listening to you. So, so at the moment, I'm finding that there are lots of youngsters coming back home to Zimbabwe. They've been outside, they've done their study outside, their studies outside, and they want to come to Zimbabwe and make a difference. And yet they come back home and there is a wall, because there is so many people on the queue for leadership who didn't have the time, because our leadership is quite aged. aged. Can we say aged? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
it's like there is no space to really excel in whatever they want to offer. So what would you like to suggest to them? What can be really, especially also in this time of lockdown? Okay, theoretically we have another week to go, and then we can start over. But what? Yeah, what would you suggest to them? How can they really start, even if small, in a small way, to go that direction instead of thinking of going back to Canada, to the States, where they left? I mean,
yes. You know, one of the statements that has always guided my life is wherever you go, there you are. And so I say to people, it doesn't matter if you go to Canada, it doesn't matter if you go to the United States. Whatever you are unable to manifest here, you won't be able to manifest there. Now, I don't say this flippantly, because I do also believe that there's certain systems that are more enabling than others. You know, so if you do go to the United States, there's more access to education, right? There's better access to healthcare, better access to all sorts of things that you can get that is different from here. But when I talk about manifestation, I'm talking about that deepest part of ourselves, that which we came to the earth to do. That has nothing to do with geography. That has nothing to do with where you live. That is connected to source and power, and nothing gets in the way of that. And I think if people remembered that, and the problem is life makes us forget, because we start to conform to what our education told us and what our degrees told us and what our religions taught us, whatever it is. And I'm like, if you remember the power with which you arrived on this earth and the purpose for which you did, that has no geography. That has to do with you being connected to convictions, to values, to beliefs that are deeper than what is happening in the outside environment. And your power to manifest that is what creates change in the world. So if we talk about all of the leaders that we admire, they were not depending on the environment for their manifestation of self. They were understanding that there was something within them that was compelling them to move from the inside to the outside to create the world that they desired. And this, for me, is the biggest calling of any young person in the world, is that all of us have gifts and talents that want to manifest, but we have to have the courage to walk that journey. And some of those journeys are not going to be easy. Like I said, I spent 3 years without being able to get to university. When I got to university, there were still questions about, will I be able to afford it, until I got on scholarships. Yeah. When I was on those scholarships in these very elite universities, I was clear about, how different I was from some of the kids who came from kind of privilege that I didn't have. So there's always challenges along the way. When I went into the work environment, I started to understand, what it means to not have somebody who can counsel you about what it even means to work. Because I didn't have those kinds of conversations growing up. What does it mean to be in a corporate setting, etc. So life will come with challenges. The question is, what kind of courage do you meet it with? And I've always said, while we talk about a crisis of leadership a lot, what I find is the much more salient thing to talk about is the crisis of courage. Do we have the courage to meet our souls, to have a conversation with our soul and what it yearns to do in the world? That is the most important conversation. And when you have that conversation, the geography is irrelevant. What wants to emerge will emerge. And that for me is authentic power. That for me is the kind of courage that the world is challenging us to have, so that we can create what it is that we deserve and we desire. So for a young person in this country, that is my message. What do you desire to create? Do you have the courage to meet this conversation with your soul and to determine what the soul desires to do in the world, and then to live that out? Is the journey going to be easy? No, but that's not the point. The point is to live out the soul's mission on this earth.
So courage sounds like a magic word. The guidance is really courage. And yeah, I understand perfectly what you're saying, because no matter where we run to, if we haven't sorted it before, that same issue is gonna follow us. So for the young people, just try one step at a time. Even if you think it's not important, just do it, and that can open a new door to something else. And that's, I mean, I find it on myself all the time. I mean, with myself all the time. Sometimes I say yes to things. Why am I saying yes? And that opens the door to something else. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Rachel, thank you very much for your time and for your beautiful sharing. And so people can get in touch with you on the narachileadership.com, correct? We'll put it down in the description in the YouTube, as well as on Instagram and LinkedIn, correct? And Facebook, I suppose.
Yes, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook.
Yeah.
Yes, we are there as Narachi Leadership, and also as Rachel Nyaradzo Adams, so they can catch me on both of those, on all of those platforms under both of those names.
Okay, so maybe there will be a next at some point. We don't know. Let's see. Thank you so much once again. And have a wonderful day. And have a wonderful day.
Me too.
Bye.